Good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the war in Ukraine titled Russian Invasion. I'm Ladi Akiridulwale. The headlines. Two large explosions hit the western outskirts of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, as a number of buildings are set on fire. Evacuation corridors are planned today in the troubled northeastern Sumy region of Ukraine. And Ukrainian government says it expects the war to be over by early May of 2022. Good morning once again, and thank you for joining us at this time. It's the 20th day of Russia's invasion, and here is a roundup of the latest developments. Russian shelling of Kyiv continued this morning with a residential building set ablaze after explosions were heard in the capital. Ukraine's State Emergency Service says the fire has now been extinguished. The regional state administration says evacuation corridors are planned to be in place between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. local time in the northeastern Sumy region. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are set to continue today, and that's according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A Ukrainian government advisor in the meantime had earlier said he expects the war to be over by early May. Let's start with our story on the expectation of when this war will end. The Ukrainian government advisor had said he expects the war to be over by early May at the latest, when Russia runs out of resources to attack its neighbor. According to Oleksiy Artesevich, an advisor to Ukrainian president's chief of staff, there should be a peace agreement by then. He outlined two possible outcomes in the months ahead. One, that there will either be a peace deal, or two, troop withdrawals will follow and there will be an attempt to scrap together an agreement by mid-April or late April. And China's top diplomat has again called for both sides to exercise restraint in a high-profile meeting with U.S. officials yesterday. Yang Jiechi, in a readout summary of the meeting published by Beijing this morning, said, quote, "All parties should exercise maximum restraint, protect civilians, and prevent a large-scale humanitarian crisis." Mr. Yang said that China was committed to promoting peace talks, adding that the legitimate concerns of all parties would need to be addressed. His comments were made at a 7-hour meeting in Rome, the Italian capital, with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which was closely watched because before it took place, U.S. officials had accused China of signaling its willingness to supply Russia with weapons. At the same meeting, a U.S. delegation led by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had raised directly and very clearly concerns over China's support for Russia. The State Department spokesman, Ned Price, said backing Russia in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine would have implications for Russia's relationships around the world, including with U.S. allies and partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Price said this at a press briefing.
We are watching very closely the extent to which the PRC, or any other country for that matter, provides any form of support, whether that's material support, whether that's economic support, whether that's financial support, to Russia. Any such support from anywhere in the world would be of great concern to us. It would be of course, the greatest concern if a country like the PRC were to be doing that, a country that, by the way, has tremendous leverage with Russia, has a relationship with Russia that is distinct from the relationship that we or just about any other country on the planet has with Russia, and with that in mind, could do more than probably many other countries to bring an end to this senseless violence, to this brutality, to Putin's premeditated war of choice. We have communicated very clearly to Beijing that we won't stand by if we will not allow any country to compensate Russia for its losses. We're not going to preview where this might go. Obviously, don't want to entertain a hypothetical like that at this point, but I can point to what has happened today. and the National Security Advisor, our Assistant Secretary, our delegation met with Yang Jiechi and his delegation to precisely make clear our concerns and to be very candid in terms of the implications. Again, we are watching very closely to the extent to which the PRC or any country in the world provides support, material, economic, financial, rhetorical, otherwise, to this war of choice that President Putin is waging against the government of Ukraine, against the state of Ukraine, against the people of Ukraine. And we have been very clear, both privately with Beijing, publicly with Beijing, that there would be consequences for any such support. It is fair to conclude that the Russian economy is in dire straits. That has been the case ever since these series of sanctions and other economic measures were instituted at the very outset of the invasion of Ukraine. We can point to any number of metrics. I did see an independent analysis that Russia is on the brink of default. We know that its credit rating is now at junk status. We know that the Russian stock market will be closed at least through this week, now going on several weeks of closure, in an apparent effort to forestall capital flight that is bound to happen as soon as the Russian stock market reopens, whenever that is. The ruble is almost literally worthless. It is worth less than a penny at this point. You could go on and on and on. Here's the point. We've made very clear that any country that would seek to attempt to bail Russia out of this economic, financial morass will be met with consequences. We will ensure that no country is able to get away with such a thing.
Head of the U.S. delegation there, Ned Price, who is a State Department spokesperson. And as Ukraine heads into the 20th day of the Russian invasion on its territory, the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces has provided its daily morning update, where it says Russian forces remain focused on maintaining their gains on Ukrainian territory, but have failed to make further advances. The Russian troops are said to have continued to launch missile and bomb attacks on critical infrastructure and are co-opting civilian infrastructure. Russian soldiers have been using healthcare facilities in occupied territories to treat wounded personnel. And according to the statement from the Ukrainian Armed Forces, 4 helicopters, 1 plane, and a cruise missile belonging to Russia were struck down by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian units have said to have managed to fend off Russian attempts to capture the heavily contested southern port city of Mariupol, and that there have been no further signs of naval landings by Russian forces in the Black Sea region. The morale and psychological state of Russian troops, according to the statement from the Ukrainians, remains low, with Russian servicemen apparently refusing to carry out commands. These assessments have not been independently verified. But now let's take a look at some of the key events so far from day 19 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As the talks go on, Russia has continued its assault, with forces attacking from the north and south of the city.
Russian and Ukrainian representatives resume talks in a bid to end weeks of fighting. It's the 4th round of talks, and the Ukrainian president's office hints at progress, saying Ukraine is pushing for an immediate ceasefire. But Russia continues its bombardment of many Ukrainian cities, with 1 person killed in a strike on a block of flats in the capital, Kyiv. Antonov Airport in northern Kyiv has been hit by Russian shelling. Ukrainian authorities say 2 people have died and 7 injured. Mariupol, a key Ukrainian port city, is also said to be suffering constant shelling, bombing, and some street battles. Thousands of civilians have been trapped there for nearly 2 weeks, surrounded by Russian troops firing rockets and shells, which have destroyed many buildings. City officials say there's a desperate need for food, water, medicine, and electricity. According to reports, a pregnant woman and her baby had died after Russia bombed the maternity hospital in Mariupol, where she was meant to give birth last week. The EU says over 2,400 civilians have died in Mariupol since Russia invaded.
I want to announce that we are finalizing the adoption of a fourth strong package of sanctions, a new package of sanctions. This package that will be approved by written procedure by the Council of Foreign Affairs Ministers will include new measures against Russian trade, market access, membership in international financial institutions, crypto assets, export of luxury goods, and targeting of steel and energy sectors.
Ukraine says it will try to evacuate trapped civilians through 10 humanitarian corridors today, including from towns near the capital, Kyiv, and in the eastern region of Luhansk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warns the Russian attacks could expand to neighboring countries and urges NATO to impose a no-fly zone. He also says the main task of his delegation at talks with the Russian counterpart was to arrange a meeting between himself and Russian President Vladimir Putin. More than 2.6 million people have fled into neighboring countries since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the country on the 24th of February 2022.
Living behind their homes and possessions, Ukrainians continue to stream out of the country a day after Russians' missiles hit a large Ukrainian base near the border with NATO member Poland in an escalation of the war to the west of the country. The attack on the Yavorov International Center for Peacekeeping and Security, which is a base just 15 miles from the Polish border, brings the conflict to the doorstep of NATO's alliance and the country that received 1.6 million of the nearly 2.6 million people that have fled Ukraine since the start of the war. Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has announced the release of $40 million from the world body's Central Emergency Response Fund to ramp up vital humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. He also called on member states to fund the global humanitarian development and recovery needs. Mr. Guterres expressed concern about the situation in Ukraine, saying the UN and humanitarian partners are working to ensure safe passage from besieged areas and to provide aid where security permits. More than 600,000 people have received some form of aid, and that's according to him. Mr. Guterres stressed that the escalation of the situation in Ukraine is hitting developing countries and the world's poorest the hardest, and planting the seeds for political instability and unrest around the globe. He urged the international community to do everything in its power to avoid mass hunger and the collapse of the global food system. The UN Secretary General also repeated his call for a ceasefire and a path of diplomacy and peace between Russia and Ukraine.
I've been in close contact with a number of countries, including China, France, Germany, India, Israel, and Turkey, on mediation efforts to bring an end to this war. It's never too late for diplomacy and dialogue. We need an immediate cessation of hostilities and serious negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We need peace. Peace for the people of Ukraine. Peace for the world.
The situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that every disagreement should have political or diplomatic solutions and that a resort to war must be carefully considered. Former commander of Nigeria's Operation Safe Haven and military analyst, Major General Augustine Agundu, said this while speaking to me on the war in Ukraine. He said that there is also a cautionary tale for all those, even in Nigeria, who call for war over what are essentially resolvable problems at the negotiating table. General Agundu asks that all should look at the amount of devastation and destruction being wrought in Ukraine, which will be difficult to repair regardless of the outcome.
Unfortunately, that region has found itself in where we are today. We know there's a lot of write-ups that come in even at the hour on what is the situation in the Ukraine. But what is there that there is devastation of the nation and human lives that could have been avoided if compromises. I listened to Ambassador Lawa in one of your programs. He dwelt so much on compromises, and I agree with him. We have to be now, irrespective of you being a member of whatever organization, African Union, United Nations, and EU, and all whatnot. There are also regional organizations, and like in the African Union, it is only that the region should solve a certain problem first. They should be the first responder to a certain conflicting situation before ever you can involve the African Union headquarters. For whatever the reasons are, my concern is the enormity of weapons that is going that direction. And do not forget that Ukraine itself produces small arms and
which they are now giving to virtually everybody, whether you are a military combatant or not.
What is going to happen if today those things are resolved? Can you recoup those weapons that have been given out? Look at what happened in Libya and how the weapons trickled southwards towards Nigeria. And what comes to my mind under this situation, because we can say it is far away from us, Russia, Ukraine, and all the situations that I want to address the situation whereby some persons here in this country are calling for war. War is not a peace bill, and the war in Ukraine has not started.
You think so?
It has not started. This is just preparation, battle preparation, moving, positioning forces and all whatnot. Look at the level of devastation, and then we are sitting down here in this country and we're inviting war to our own nation. Look at our population. Look at the refugee, the humanitarian crisis that has come up as a result of. We are still battling with Lagos population as 20 million or what. If 2 million move westwards, they will take over the whole of that country. Or those countries towards that.
Benin Republic, Togo.
So nobody should call for war in this country. Every political situation, every political decision, every disagreement has solutions. And this is the only, when I look at Russia, Ukraine, of course, we don't need to delve into it so much as it is. But I want to bring it home. If this is to happen in Nigeria, what is going to happen? How are we going to take it?
That's a lot of food for thought.
That is what I will ask those who are beating the drums that they should think about.
Time to take our first break, and when we come back, as usual, we'll be taking a look at some of the business stories and the implications both globally and right here within Nigeria. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back to Russian Invasion. And as promised, I'm being joined by our business correspondent, Ini John McQuarrie. Ini, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We're seeing more and more impact of this war in Ukraine. There's the European Union's fourth round of sanctions.
Fourth round of sanctions. Well, some people have said it may not have a lot of impact, but the fact that 25 countries will come together, to agree, even if it's just a trickle, we won't buy this product. The US now have now said they won't buy things like vodka and some other seemingly little items. But when you have 25 countries coming together to agree on something like that, then it has, it becomes more impactful. For instance, now they're talking about excluding Russia from the World Trade Organization and removing the special status, trading status that they have with them. So that means that Russia will now be open to more tariffs, more taxes, trade barriers, So if this, you can say for now that already we're not trading with them, we're not buying their products, and Russia, of course, has retaliated by saying we're not going to buy your product, we're not going to export, to you. They've stopped exports of their wheat already. But
which is bound to have an impact, either in the short or medium term.
It's already having an impact. Already having an impact. The world is scrambling for wheat, especially wheat, and of course oil. So it might seem little. It's little, but when you put the little together, then it has a major impact.
There's quite a bit of that.
Yes.
Now, the sanctions themselves, of course, we're talking about a fourth round now.
Yes.
But the first, the second, the third round, the impact is being felt. Just earlier on, before you came on, we had a State Department spokesman talking about the fact that Russia is about to default. And I remember that you and I spoke about this last week.
It's tomorrow. And I think it's already settled that they're going to default, which was why they went to the desperate measure of threatening to pay with rubles.
Yeah.
But, who does that when you're owing in dollars? So it's already having an impact. But guess what? They are also looking for ways to cushion or maybe retaliate. For instance, I know you know that about 300 multinationals have left their country now.
That's right.
They're looking for how to take over. Their lawyers are very busy at this time trying to look for how they can claim the asset, at least 25% of those assets. But more importantly, about $10 million, is at stake now because there were some aircrafts that Russia leased from the West. Now they are threatening not to return it. And it costs about $10 billion or $10 billion. $10 billion. That will do something to the West. So they are also, looking for ways to send a message back to the West to say, okay, you're doing this, we can also do this. And Belarus, I think it's been established at this time that Belarus is assisting them. So they are also feeling the impact. Belarus has been trying to get on the World Trade Organization for some time now. So the EU is saying, well, that application has been dumped now, the fact that you're helping. And that's what they're trying to tell China, that if they notice that you're helping, Russia reached out to China to ask for economic
some level of help, yes.
That if they do, then the sanctions will spread over to them.
Well, there is also the issue of food protectionism. You referred to it earlier when you talked about, the issue of wheat. Now, just before we came on air, I was having a discussion with one of the production staff, and we were discussing the issue that, look, it's bad enough that there's a war going on in a region that produces quite a lot of food and foodstuff for the world. But it's even worse because others who were not producing as much have now seemingly placed an export ban.
They've shut their borders, shut their doors, and they're like, whatever we produce. Things like sugar. Algeria has sugar and some other little things like that. They've shut their doors. They are not exporting. Egypt has done the same thing. They're like, we don't know how long this war is going to last for. And even if, the war ends today, of course you have the lasting effects. It's going to be there for, if analysts are saying it might take Russia itself about 30 years to recover, from some of the sanctions that have been placed on them. So apparently, and then the war may not be the same again. So countries are trying to protect themselves. Some countries, especially in Africa, they have removed some import bills, like Egypt has done that on rice, on beans, some of those grains. So now, if you're a business person in Egypt and you are able to import rice, beans, and lentils, then you are not paying any imports duties, because they just want to encourage people, bring as much food as you can, because we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation. Let's just protect ourselves.
I've listened to some of the conversations you've had on your program and on the other business show about this issue of food and what can be done to ensure security at our own level, and by that I mean in Nigeria. I don't know, what are the analysts, what have they been telling you about some of these products which we import large quantities of, you just mentioned rice,
Yes.
just to take an example.
Yes.
Of course, I've heard elsewhere about fertilizer and other things. We've talked about wheat, there's barley and all of that. What have you gleaned from what the analysts have told you about how we are preparing? Because I've not heard anything about bans here, about exports
Exactly.
and so on.
In fact, there was an individual that had to speak out, a business person, that had to speak out to tell the federal government, please stop exporting, was it rice or one of the grains? No, it was corn. Please stop exporting corn at this time. I mean, countries are already taking steps to protect themselves. LCCI had said that the government should open up its reserves and all that. If we have things in that reserve, that is another. But people are saying, analysts especially are saying, there seemed to be no coordinated and intentional effort to protect our food security, to boost income at this, to boost production at this time, and to stop the exports. We can't afford to export at this time because we do not know how long this is going to last for. Already, there's food insecurity in Nigeria.
Yeah, long before this
Long
happened.
before all of this, before COVID, and then COVID came, we are not done with COVID. And then, and even in the areas that we could leverage on, to make extra money, which is gas, for instance.
Yes, one of my guests was making reference to that.
Yes, we are not, which is crude, even crude. I mean, the price is tapering now because of the peace talks. We are not doing it. So can we at least, in the little area that we have, can we try to conserve what we have and manage it? And then maybe there are some low-hanging fruits, short investment that can be done to farmers in some crops that we have comparative advantage with, so that we can boost our production at this time.
And then, of course, you touched on it just in your last answer, which is the issue of oil prices.
Yes.
That remains
Do you
volatile.
know, for the first time in 3 weeks, oil went to below $100 yesterday. And it's there's a lot of sentiment in the market because of the peace talks going on. And I think the Ukrainian president did say that there are hope of, ceasefire and settlement. At least seems that there's
He's even
progress.
now talking about a meeting with the Russian president.
Yes, exactly. He did say that. So all of that brought kind of calm in the market to an extent. This morning is 102, 101, 100. But yesterday, for the first time in 3 weeks, that went lower than $100. So the market is very reactive and sentimental, but we actually did lose an opportunity to make some money in Nigeria.
I can feel the pain in your voice, Ini. But again, of course, this is as always a continuing conversation, which we'll continue to have. And incidentally, my very next guest is also going to expatiate on what you're talking about. Perhaps I'll ask him about this issue of how are we expected to prepare the short-term investments you've made you've talked about for us to enhance our own preparations for what may. Even the Ukrainians are now saying that they expect this to go on until end of April / early May.
Wow.
At the earliest or at the latest. And if that is the case, then what are we to do between now?
What are we going to do?
And then,
when prices, diesel is more than 700, oil prices,
It's a situation that, of course, one will continue to monitor very closely.
Sure
but for now, thank you so much, Ini. Ini will be on, as always, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Business Incorporated. Lottie Williams will be here just after this program with Business Morning. So if you want more on all this, please join them for that. For the meantime, thank you so much,
Thank
Ini.
you so much for having me.
Now, let's talk to Jimmy Bobine, who's head of Augusto Consulting. He joins us virtually. Good morning, Jimmy. How are you doing?
Sorry, good morning, Laddie. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice for you to join us, although the subject of discussion is not exactly pleasant. But I was just talking to Ini here in the studio, and we were taking a look at some of this issue of sanctions and how countries the world over are preparing themselves for the inevitable, ensuring that they are secure and that their people have enough to deal with, to grapple with, even while peace talks are going on. But let me begin with what, in your mind, what you're seeing with the effect of all these sanctions that have been placed on Russia and what Russia is attempting to do in return, and then, of course, all the other outside players in this battle. What do you make of the whole thing coming from an economic perspective?
Okay, from an economic perspective, Ladi, I think there's enough commentary really on the global picture, on the global happenings. So if you do not mind, let's focus a bit on how this affects our dear country, Nigeria.
Absolutely.
Right? And let's see how this is shaping out for Nigeria. So first, the big story out there is oil and gas. And as you can see, oil and gas, you refer to that, oil and gas is at its highest in close to a decade, in about a decade, well over $100. And so the projections for the year is that it could do as much as between 80 to a wide band, if I may use, between 80 to $120 on the average for the rest of 2022. Ordinarily, Laddie, that should portend some level of comfort for Nigeria. Would that be good for global economic growth, especially on the back of all of the COVID recoveries? No. Okay. But like I said, if we have to narrow the narratives down to Nigeria, ordinarily, that should be good for Nigeria. So, but on the back of that, we think that we'll expect higher FAC receipts this year. Nigeria should earn more from FAC this year on the back of the higher oil prices. We're looking at over 6 trillion from FAC. Federation account about 10 to 11 trillion. So federal government alone should be looking at about 5 trillion in FAC. Last year about 4 trillion, and then we're saying to ourselves that the federation account may earn as much as 10 to 11 trillion. However, why would Nigeria not be popping the champagnes to say that we're in a season of high oil prices once again, and high oil prices always portend good for the Nigerian economy? It's because we were not prepared for a time such as this. Okay, if I would just repeat it slowly again, Nigeria was not prepared for a time such as this. And why were we not prepared? We're going to be receiving oil revenues from our right hand. And like I said, the projection for this year is about 5 trillion for the federal government alone. But the downside is that with our left hand, we'll be giving out at about 4 trillion in subsidies if we maintain current subsidy levels. What do I mean by subsidies? I mean the downstream petroleum subsidy. All over the world, if you follow the narratives, especially amongst Nigerians in the diaspora, the big commentary today is gas prices, petrol prices have been increased. But here in Nigeria, we faced a bit of supply shocks. Things are stabilizing. But one thing that isn't changing is the price at the filling station. However, all of the input costs, especially the raw material, the crude oil, has increased, but we're still buying petrol normally. So we're paying a dear price for it. And the price we're paying for it is that we're going to earn more in oil, but we're going to also spend more on subsidies for petrol. So it's nearly a scenario of -1 + 1, go back to 0. Okay.
That's frightening. That is frightening. But something else that has come up, of course, is the fact that between Russia and Ukraine, they produce quite a lot of important material for food and manufacturing industry. I was discussing yesterday with a guest who pointed out that a lot of ores and other metals that go into smartphones, that go into computer soft hardware and all of that come from those two countries. But I wanted us to focus on the one that has become obvious almost immediately, which is things like wheat and barley and manufacturing industries in the breweries and the baking industry, which produces bread, biscuits, and things like that. Again, from the narrow perspective you talked about earlier, the Nigerian perspective, we're already beginning to see the impact of this. And if this goes on for much longer than it has already, what do you see happening in terms of how this will impact on our economy?
So still on that narrow perspective, yes, computers, all of that, phone chips, all of that, yes, it's true. But when when you're talking about the price of bread, a loaf of bread, then I think the issue of the rise in prices or the potential rise in prices of food can actually take a bow. That kind of conversation can take a bow, because what we're talking about here is the price of bread, the price of wheat. So, what kinds of industries first can be affected? You've actually dimensioned it. So, first the flour milling industry, and then that entire value chain within that wheat space: flour milling, bakery, confectionaries, those three major industries, and maybe drug manufacturing, whatever industry, breweries that may depend on additives from all of that wheat space. So Nigeria imports about a fifth of its wheat supply from Russia. Between Ukraine and Russia, you have about a third in production of global wheat. So what this means is that, and secondly, bread is one of the biggest staples in Nigeria. Remember, all of our local staples all have some level of seasonality. Yam, plantain, and even all of the maize meals, they typically have seasonality. So
That's right.
the major staple that doesn't suffer this seasonality effect, either upside or downside of seasonality, is bread. So bread is one of Nigeria's most important staples, even above rice, right? And as fate would have it, yes, there have been conversations, there have been initiatives and investments into increasing wheat production, but it hasn't just succeeded. So right now, we're still quite dependent on wheat for our local bread supplies, our local bread production, cakes, confectionaries, biscuits. Biscuits is another very reliable snack, especially for kids in Nigeria. So it's until you speak with a biscuit manufacturer before you realize and appreciate how much biscuit is a supporting meal, as a snack for kids. So we still are heavily dependent on Russia. Do we have alternatives? Yes, we have alternatives from the old Russian federations, all of the Eastern European countries. We actually do also import wheat from them, but it's lower variants of wheat, not as expensive as the Russian variants. But I think at this time we'll make do with whatever we have. Would it affect these industries materially? Oh, yes, it would. We're looking at prices of upwards of 30 to 50% in the tonnage price of wheat this year. How would that impact on bakeries? We already hearing the bread producers crying, and remember that the bread producers also have to struggle with twin effects of energy crisis. So if just yesterday there was a headline that the national grid collapsed and all of the electricity distribution companies are sending out forward apology notes that would not be able to meet supplies and all of that. So if you're a bread manufacturer, what that means is that you have to get off the grid and onto your own independent supply, which comes from a generator. Most likely, generator depends on diesel, depending on your scale. Diesel is not a subsidized commodity in Nigeria, so it enjoys market volatilities. It also suffers from market volatilities. So as a bread producer here, you're going to suffer the downside risk from increase in diesel prices. You're going to suffer the downside risk from increase in wheat prices, which would affect flour. Same with the cake manufacturer. And remember that in the flour milling space, and this is something that the narratives out there are picking right now, we have a very oligopolistic flour milling industry. And it's even grown more oligopolistic because flour mills just absorbed Honeywell, right? So you have about three major flour millers in the country today, one dominant flour miller in the country today, which means that wherever you have this kind of dominance, it's never good for clients to that dominant player. Okay, so but even at that, the flour milling industry, which has been very good at passing on costs of increased costs in wheat prices to bakeries, may actually suffer this year, because we think that this is the year where bread producers will snap. What would it lead to? We may see it could potentially, and I'm being very careful about these doomsday scenarios, it could potentially affect the health viability and going concern status of small and vulnerable bakeries. Secondly, it could also potentially affect the quality of bread. Remember that the bakery business in Nigeria is quite fragmented, and the ability of NAFDAC to provide regulatory oversight on the bakery industry due to the level of fragmentation is quite challenged. So what that means is that what's the quality of bread from a bakery that is struggling to survive, struggling on energy costs, struggling on bakeries? What kind of ingredients will they start to use to just survive? It'll be an interesting question, and an agency like NAFDAC would have to raise its game to ensure that we're not eating the kinds of things we're not supposed to eat because companies just have to stay afloat, or bakeries just have to stay afloat.
This is frightening. This is frightening stuff. I wanted, of course, to ask you. We'll take a break. When we come back from that break, I'm going to still have you with us because I have one more thing to ask about, and that has to do with aviation. We know that the aviation industry now is on the verge of a shutdown, an accumulation of several problems which have now been exacerbated by the difficulties, the disruptions in the supply chain as a result of this battle. So please stay on with us, Jimmy. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us. Welcome back. Jimmy Ogbobene of Augusto Consulting is still with us. Thank you for your time. As I said before we went on the break, there's still one more issue which is likely to impact on quite a number of us, and that is the aviation industry. For about a week now, its operators have said that given the situation, even the regulators have now said that given the situation, that industry may have to shut down. This is something else that will have a big economic impact. We're hearing, though, that, a kind of reprieve has come in the sense that for the next 2 or 3 days, the NNPC says it will provide aviation fuel to them at 500 naira, but that's only for the next 3 days. A more fundamental problem is still on the ground, and that's been exacerbated by this Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do you see that playing out?
For the aviation industry, I have a sense of empathy for that industry for one major reason. If you remember, at the peak of COVID in 2020, the aviation industry was one of the most affected. The aviation industry, hospitality, because planes were entirely grounded, airports were grounded, shut down, and all of that. So the aviation industry, to be fair to them, are still reeling on the back of the COVID. And they are still in recovery phase, but whatever growth that industry has recorded in the last year and good projections we're looking out for in 2022 hasn't still taken them back to, say, 2019 levels. So that's one issue we need to consider. Now, the second issue we need to also consider is, on one hand, we clamor for free pricing, market-driven economy in things like in the energy space, particularly petrol prices. On the other end, when we see the reality of free market, sometimes we balk and we're asking for controls all over again. We're asking for a command structure. So what NNPC is doing here is to increase the fiscal hole that we have seen. We talked about a 4 trillion naira figure for 2022 for petrol subsidy. That 4 trillion naira figure doesn't include subsidies for aviation. Now, for aviation, the reality is this. If we want to reform, then we should reform. If we do not want to reform, then let's have a different conversation. Aviation ticket prices should reflect all of the costs. There are no controls there. There are no controls. So if prices, if your input cost goes up, then I think that should reflect on the prices. So the problem here is, if you look at it especially from a consulting perspective, the aviation industry prior to this time has not conducted itself in such a manner that it can easily pass on cost to consumers. So You have incidents of people waiting for 10, 12 hours in airports, and there's no reprieve, no sanction from either the regulators or from the aviation industry, or from the operators. So Nigerians have lost confidence in the aviation sector prior to this time. And the effect of that loss, that confidence erosion in the industry prior to this time, is that the industry then suffers in its ability to pass on cost to consumers. Because ordinarily, an issue of this nature should reflect in higher prices of air tickets. But the industry has consistently lost passengers due to the underlying morass in that industry. You have more people today who are saying to themselves, why would I wait 12 hours in an airport because of flight delays when a road trip would have taken me 4 to 5 hours or 6 hours or even at most 9 hours? You have people who say, someone else called me as at the time I got to the airport, he had arrived in Abuja and I was still in the airport in Lagos. So that industry has consistently lost passengers due to these fundamental issues. So at a time like this, they are now struggling. And let's also remember that the world in 2019, prior to COVID, is not the world we know today. Ladi, if this were pre-COVID, I would have been in your studio talking to you face to face. But today, there are higher efficiencies on both parties. I'm not stuck in traffic. I'm not travel time. I've saved travel time, increased efficiency. I'm right at my desk speaking to you. And 2 minutes after this meeting with you, this session with you, I'm back at work. I'll do the same thing for a client in Yola, for a client in Kano, a client in Port Harcourt, a client in Abuja, such that it has limited interstate travel, and even travel across the continent. The aviation industry needs new thinking. The aviation industry needs increased efficiency. It needs better customer service, because like Nigeria as a whole, the aviation industry was not prepared for a time like this.
Indeed, I guess this situation, the double whammy, if you like, of this invasion of Ukraine and then what has happened with COVID before that, is now coming. The chickens, as they say, are coming home to roost now. We'll have to keep watching those. But I want to thank you, Jimmy Ogboboni, for your time today. Jimmy is the head of Augusto Consulting. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has said that authorities had blocked a yacht in the port of Barcelona, which 2 sources later said belonged to an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Mr. Sanchez said this during an interview on Spanish television, where he insisted that the official term for the seizure was technically immobilized. A transport ministry source said the 85-meter super yacht is named Valerie and is linked to Sergei Chemezov, a former KGB officer who heads state conglomerate Rostec. A second source with knowledge of the matter also confirmed the yacht's name and the link to Mr. Chemezov. The West has sanctioned Russian billionaires, frozen state assets, and cut off much of the Russian corporate sector from the global economy in an attempt to force Russian President Vladimir Putin to change course following the invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th. The National Aeronautical Space Administration, or NASA, had said that there are no signs of tension between U.S. and Russian crew members aboard the International Space Station amidst the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Joel Montalbano, manager of the International Space Station, had told Reuters at reporters at a news briefing ahead of Tuesday's planned spacewalk that, quote, when you are in space, there are no borders. You don't see country lines or state lines. The teams work together.
Before I go too further, I do want to address, what's going on, in the world events around this. I can tell you that for over 20 years, the International Space Station Partnership has operated successfully in order to do what we do on orbit and on the ground with the International Space Station. We continue with our utilization and research program, our technology development program. We continue with our low Earth orbit commercialization. All these activities have continued for 20 years, and nothing has changed in the last 3 weeks. The control centers operate successfully, flawlessly, seamlessly. We're not seeing any impacts to what's going on around us. We're able to do our jobs. We're aware of what's going on, but we are able to do our jobs and continue operations. At this time, there's no indication from our Russian partners that they want to do anything different. So we are planning to continue operations as we are today. You've heard this before, but when you're in space, there's no borders. You don't see country lines or state lines. So the teams continue to work together. Are they aware of what's going on Earth? Absolutely. But the teams are professional. The astronauts and cosmonauts are some of the most professional groups you'll ever see. They continue to operate well. They continue to operate, above all this work, and there's really no tensions with the team. This is what they've been trained to do, a job, and they're up there doing that job.
Coming to sports news, people have gathered on the streets of Beijing to watch fireworks amidst tight security just after the closing ceremony of the 2022 Paralympic Games. One resident had praised the impact the Games had on encouraging children to take up sports. Other residents praised the efforts of the Chinese Paralympians, which saw the country top the medal tally. Chinese President Xi Jinping attended that closing ceremony, along with the IPC President Andrew Parsons, who had described the Paralympians as beacons of hope and champions for peace in his closing remarks at a very difficult time. And sanctioned Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich has been spotted in a VIP lounge at Tel Aviv's airport shortly before a jet linked to him took off for Istanbul. A photograph obtained showed Mr. Abramovich, owner of Chelsea Football Club, sitting in the lounge with a face mask pulled down over his chin. This could not be immediately verified as to whether he was on board a plane when it eventually left. And so on that note, that we're going to end the program today. Thank you so much for joining us. There's an update at 5 o'clock in the evening. You join Amarachi Ubani and Millicent Walker for that. Business in Morning is next in a couple of minutes. My name is Ladi Akuri. Do have a great day.